In this quiet documentary, the narrative drifts back into deep time, to an age when the world felt vast, uncertain, and filled with unseen forces. It follows the earliest moments when human communities began to sense meaning beyond the visible, shaping rituals, symbols, and stories to explain the rhythms of nature and the mysteries of existence. Through a slow and gentle unfolding, it explores how the first ideas of gods emerged, not suddenly or dramatically, but as a natural extension of daily life, memory, and shared experience. Long before temples rose from stone or prayers were spoken in formal words, human life unfolded beneath open skies, shaped by seasons that returned without explanation, and landscapes that inspired both comfort and unease. Early communities lived close to the earth, attentive to the subtle changes in light, wind, and temperature that signaled the turning of time. Dawn arrived softly, bringing pale color to the horizon, while night settled slowly, carrying deep silence broken only by insects, distant animals, and the low crackle of fire. In this world, existence felt immediate and fragile, sustained by routine, yet surrounded by forces that could not be fully understood. The land itself seemed alive with intention. Rivers flooded and receded, sometimes nourishing fields, sometimes erasing familiar paths. Forests offered shelter and food, but also hid movements beyond sight. The sky shifted endlessly above, its patterns repeating yet never fully predictable. Storms gathered without warning, their sounds rolling across plains and valleys, reminding early humans of how little control they held over the world around them. In response, attention turned naturally toward interpretation, toward finding meaning in repetition, coincidence, and change. Within small groups gathered around shared fires, observation slowly transformed into reflection. A successful hunt followed a ritual gesture. A season of abundance coincided with a careful offering. Over time, these associations settled into memory, shaping a sense that the world responded to actions, intentions, and respect. What began as quiet acknowledgement gradually became tradition. Stones were placed deliberately. Objects were arranged with care. Words were spoken not only to one another, but to the unseen. These early gestures did not arise from fear alone, nor from a desire for control, but from the human tendency to connect experience with meaning. The passing of elders, the arrival of children, the return of migrating animals, and the steady movement of celestial bodies all invited reflection. Life unfolded within cycles that felt larger than any individual, encouraging the sense that something enduring watched, listened, or guided from beyond immediate perception. As generations passed, these shared interpretations deepened. Stories were repeated, symbols refined, and practices preserved. What had once been a simple response to uncertainty began to form a quiet structure of belief. In this way, the earliest forms of worship emerged, not as doctrine or command, but as a gentle attempt to understand existence itself. From these beginnings, the long human relationship with gods slowly took shape, rooted in daily life, observation, and the enduring search for meaning. As these early ideas settled quietly into shared memory, daily life continued with its familiar rhythm, shaped by repetition and necessity. Small communities moved through their days guided by light and season, waking as the horizon softened and resting when darkness returned. The world was intimate and immediate. Hands touched soil, stone, wood, and water each day, learning their textures through constant use. life was not separated into sacred and ordinary. Everything unfolded within the same continuous flow. Morning often began with the slow preparation of simple tasks. Fires were rekindled from embers kept alive through the night, their warmth spreading gently through the cool air. Food was gathered, prepared, and shared without haste. The sounds of grinding grain, shaping tools, or weaving fibers blended with birdsong and wind moving through grass or leaves. These sounds formed a steady backdrop, reassuring in their familiarity. Each action connected directly to survival, leaving little space between effort and outcome. Nature surrounded these communities closely, never distant or abstract. Weather shaped decisions moment by moment. Clouds gathering on the horizon altered plans for travel or work. A sudden drop in temperature signaled the approach of night or seasonal change. In this closeness, patterns became noticeable. Certain gestures seemed to precede good fortune. Particular places felt calmer, others more unsettling. Over time, attention lingered on these impressions, not with urgency, but with quiet curiosity. Hunting and gathering carried their own rituals, though at first they were unspoken. Before setting out, a pause might occur, a moment of stillness, a shared glance, a familiar motion repeated without explanation. These gestures did not yet name any deity. They simply acknowledged uncertainty. When success followed, memory linked the outcome to the action. When it did not, reflection followed just as gently. In this way, meaning began to gather around repeated experience. Evening brought communities together again. Fires burned steadily, casting soft light across faces marked by weather and time. Stories emerged naturally, shaped by the day's events. An animal seen at the edge of the forest, a sound heard in the distance, a dream recalled upon waking. All found their place in shared conversation. These stories did not seek to explain everything. They simply connected experience to emotion, weaving individual moments into something collective. The night sky played a quiet role in this early awareness. Stars appeared in familiar patterns, returning again and again in the same arrangements. The moon grew and diminished with steady rhythm. These cycles offered reassurance, suggesting order beyond immediate unpredictability. Over time, certain celestial movements became markers of season, signaling when to prepare, move, or rest. Attention turned upward as naturally as it turned toward the land. In this steady environment, belief did not arrive as a sudden realization. It emerged slowly, shaped by daily repetition. Actions, places, and moments gathered significance through familiarity rather than declaration. A particular tree offered shade year after year. A bend in the river provided food reliably. A cave sheltered generations from storm and cold. Gratitude toward these places developed quietly, expressed through care, avoidance, or gentle offerings left behind without ceremony. These early expressions carried no formal structure. There were no names, no defined gods, no separation between natural and divine. Instead, there was awareness, a sense that the world responded, that it held memory, and that human presence existed within something larger and enduring. From this awareness, the earliest roots of worship began to form, grounded firmly in the routines of everyday life. As days passed and seasons shifted, routine carried meaning forward without conscious intention. Repetition shaped understanding more deeply than instruction ever could. The same paths were walked again and again, feet pressing the earth into memory. The same waters were drawn at dawn, reflecting sky and movement in quiet patterns. Through this repetition, familiarity deepened into attachment. Places were no longer neutral. They carried feeling, expectation, and subtle presence. Certain locations gradually stood apart. A clearing where animals often appeared felt different from surrounding ground. A stone outcrop that caught the last light of evening held a calm stillness. These distinctions were not spoken aloud at first. They were sensed. Movement slowed in these spaces. Voices lowered naturally. Over time, small gestures appeared. Stones stacked, branches arranged, objects placed and left undisturbed. These actions marked attention rather than ownership, acknowledging something perceived but unnamed. Loss also shaped early belief gently and persistently. When members of a community failed to return, their absence lingered. Tools remained unused. Places once shared felt altered. The body was no longer present, yet memory continued. This disconnect invited reflection. The breath had gone, but something remained. An impression, a presence carried in stories and silence. Over time, this sense of continuation softened fear and nurtured imagination. The idea that life extended beyond the visible began to take quiet form. Dreams played a subtle role in this process. During rest, familiar faces appeared unexpectedly. Scenes unfolded without logic, blending past and present. These experiences felt vivid, sometimes more real than waking moments. Upon returning to daylight, they resisted dismissal. Dreams suggested movement beyond the body, encounters beyond place. Shared quietly around the fire, they added another layer to the growing sense that existence extended beyond immediate perception. Animals were observed with careful attention. Their movements often seemed deliberate. Guided by instinct, humans could not fully share. Certain animals appeared during important moments, before a journey, near a birth, after a death. These coincidences were remembered. Over time, animals began to carry symbolic weight, representing strength, guidance, or transition. Their presence near significant events reinforced the sense that the world communicated through signs rather than words. Sound and silence both contributed to this awareness. The sudden quiet before a storm, the distant call at night, the rhythmic pulse of insects after dusk, each carried emotional weight. Silence in particular felt full rather than empty. In those moments, attention turned inward, encouraging reflection rather than action. These pauses created space for interpretation, allowing belief to grow without structure. Gradually, shared gestures became more deliberate. Food might be placed aside before a meal. Water poured slowly onto the ground before drinking. These offerings were small, practical, and unremarkable, yet deeply meaningful. They expressed respect for the unseen forces perceived in daily life. No expectation of response was attached. The act itself was sufficient. Through these practices, belief emerged not as explanation, but as relationship. The world was not something to be controlled, but something to be acknowledged. Humans lived within it, dependent upon rhythms they did not govern. Worship, in its earliest form, was simply attentiveness, a way of moving through life with awareness and care. This attentiveness deepened slowly, preparing the ground for more defined expressions of belief as communities grew and memory extended further across generations. As generations followed one another, memory stretched further into the past, carried not only by experience, but by careful repetition. Elders spoke of events that had occurred long before the present moment, recalling seasons of abundance or hardship with equal calm. These stories were not told to impress or instruct, but to preserve continuity. Through them, the living remained connected to those who had come before, reinforcing the sense that life moved along a shared path, rather than beginning anew with each birth. Within these stories, patterns emerged. Certain actions were remembered as beneficial, others as unwise. Places where ancestors had rested or gathered gained quiet importance. The ground itself seemed to hold remembrance, encouraging careful behavior. When a fire was lit in a familiar place, it felt different than one lit elsewhere. When food was prepared according to old habits, it carried reassurance beyond nourishment. These sensations strengthened the belief that the past remained present, woven into daily routine. Children absorbed these impressions naturally. They learned not through instruction alone, but through observation. They noticed where elders paused, which objects were handled gently, and which moments were marked by silence. These cues shaped understanding long before explanation was possible. In this way, belief passed quietly from one generation to the next, embedded in behavior rather than doctrine. The natural world continued to offer reinforcement. Seasonal cycles repeated with dependable rhythm. After cold came warmth. After darkness, light returned. This consistency suggested endurance beyond individual lifespan. Even when conditions shifted unexpectedly, the broader pattern remained intact. Over time, this reliability encouraged trust, not in predictability alone, but in continuity. The world, though uncertain, was not chaotic. Fire held particular significance. It transformed raw material into sustenance, darkness into warmth. It required care to maintain and attention to control. Gathered around it, communities felt both comfort and respect. Flames were observed closely, their movement unpredictable yet contained. Over time, fire became associated with transformation itself, a visible reminder that change could occur without destruction. This association deepened reflection on unseen forces that shaped life quietly and persistently. Water carried similar meaning. Rivers flowed steadily, returning again and again despite constant movement. Springs emerged from unseen depths, offering renewal without explanation. Rain fell unevenly, sometimes abundant, sometimes scarce. These behaviors encouraged careful observation rather than assumption. Water became a symbol of continuity and transition, reinforcing the sense that life moved through phases rather than ending abruptly. As these elements gained symbolic weight, the idea of intentional forces behind them grew naturally, not as rulers or judges, but as presences embedded within the world's rhythms. These forces did not demand attention. They revealed themselves through repetition and consistency. To acknowledge them was simply to notice, to move through life with awareness of connection rather than isolation. Over time, certain gestures became expected rather than optional. A pause before entering a forest, a quiet moment before a journey. These actions were not enforced, yet rarely omitted. Their absence felt noticeable, disrupting the sense of balance that communities had come to rely upon. Through these shared habits, belief became communal, shaping identity without rigid boundaries. By this stage, worship existed not as structured ritual, but as shared understanding. It lived in movement, memory, and quiet acknowledgement. From this foundation, more defined expressions of belief would eventually emerge, shaped by growing communities and expanding imagination. As these shared understandings settled into the rhythm of daily life, they began to form an invisible framework through which the world was interpreted. Actions were no longer isolated events. They were part of a continuous relationship between people, place, and memory. A successful harvest felt connected to careful preparation and respectful conduct. A season of difficulty invited reflection rather than blame. In this way, belief offered coherence, gently binding experience into a larger pattern. Communal gatherings slowly took on deeper significance. When people came together to share food, mark seasonal changes, or remember those who had passed, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Voices softened, movement slowed. Attention turned inward as much as outward. These moments required no instruction. Their tone emerged naturally from shared expectation. The sense of being part of something enduring became especially strong during these gatherings, reinforcing connection beyond individual lives. Objects began to carry memory as well. A stone used repeatedly in the same place, a vessel passed between generations, a tool no longer practical but still kept, all held meaning beyond function. Their presence served as quiet reminders of continuity. Handling them required care, not because they were fragile, but because they represented accumulated experience. In this way, material culture began to support belief, anchoring abstract ideas in tangible form. Over time, certain individuals became recognized for their attentiveness to these patterns. They remembered stories accurately, observed seasonal changes closely, and guided communal behavior through example rather than authority. Their role was not defined by power, but by familiarity with tradition. When questions arose or uncertainty lingered, these individuals offered reassurance through calm repetition of shared understanding. Their presence helped stabilize belief without formal leadership. The boundaries between natural and spiritual awareness remained fluid. A tree was still a tree, a river still water, yet both carried layered significance shaped by interaction and memory. This blending allowed belief to remain grounded, connected directly to lived experience rather than abstract concept. Worship, at this stage, required no separation from daily life. It existed within it, shaping behavior subtly and consistently. As communities grew slightly larger and interaction increased, these foundational beliefs traveled with people. When families moved, they carried habits and gestures with them. New places were approached with the same attentiveness applied to familiar ground. Over time, shared patterns emerged across wider areas, linking separate groups through similar expressions of respect and acknowledgement. These connections formed quietly, without coordination, guided by shared human perception. By the end of this long, gradual process, belief had become inseparable from identity. It shaped how people understood themselves in relation to the world and one another. Though no formal gods had yet taken clear shape, the conditions for their emergence were firmly in place. Shared memory, symbolic behavior, and communal attention had created a fertile ground for more defined expressions of worship. From this deep foundation of everyday experience, the story now moves gently toward moments where belief began to crystallize around figures, stories, and names, where the unseen forces sensed in daily life slowly gathered into the earliest forms of gods. As these early forms of belief settled quietly into the fabric of daily life, they did not remain formless for long. Memory, repetition, and shared attention slowly encouraged belief to gather shape. What had once been sensed only as presence or pattern began to be spoken of through stories. These stories did not seek precision. They offered familiarity, continuity, and reassurance. Through them, unseen forces acquired character, intention, and lineage. In this gentle way, belief moved from diffuse awareness toward recognizable figures, preparing the ground for the earliest gods. As early belief settled into the rhythms of daily life, it gradually began to take shape through memory and repetition. What had once been sensed only as presence or pattern slowly gained form through shared stories, passed gently between people who gathered at the end of each day. These stories did not attempt to explain the world completely. They offered familiarity instead, weaving experience into narrative so that life felt continuous rather than fragmented. Around fires that burned steadily through the evening, events were recalled with calm attention. A storm that arrived without warning, an animal that appeared repeatedly near the edge of a clearing, a season that brought abundance, followed by one that required patience. Over time, these occurrences were no longer treated as isolated moments. They were connected through story, and through that connection, meaning began to gather. Natural forces were spoken of as if they listened. The wind was described as restless or gentle. The river was remembered as generous one year and distant the next. These descriptions did not imply control or command. They reflected relationship. By giving voice to the world, early communities found a way to respond to it emotionally as well as practically. The landscape became familiar not only through use, but through personality shaped by memory. From this storytelling, the earliest sacred figures emerged. They were not distant creators or rulers. They were expressions of the world as it was experienced. In dry regions, attention turned toward forces associated with rain and renewal. In colder landscapes, warmth and fire carried deeper meaning. Forests encouraged reverence for animals, while open plains emphasized sky and horizon. Each environment shaped belief quietly, without uniformity or doctrine. Naming developed slowly. A name allowed a presence to be referenced, remembered, and shared consistently. It did not define the presence completely. It offered a point of recognition. Through names, stories stabilized, allowing sacred figures to persist across generations. These names were spoken softly, woven into narrative rather than invoked with command. Familiarity grew without certainty. Ritual followed naturally from habit. A pause before eating. A portion of food set aside. A quiet moment before departure. These acts were modest and practical, fitting easily into routine. They required no instruction and carried no expectation of response. Their purpose was acknowledgement. Through them, belief remained grounded in everyday life rather than separated from it. At this stage, gods were not clearly distinct from the world itself. They were present within it, moving through weather, landscape, and change. Worship existed not as a formal act, but as attentiveness, an ongoing awareness that life unfolded within forces larger than individual effort. As generations passed, sacred figures accumulated history. Stories expanded backward into origins and forward into expectation. They described how rivers found their paths, why animals behaved as they did, and how seasons came to follow one another. These accounts were not fixed. They shifted gently as they were retold, absorbing new experience while preserving familiar structure. Through this flexibility, belief remained alive rather than preserved. Certain individuals became known for their ability to remember and repeat these stories with care. Their role was informal, shaped by trust rather than authority. They listened closely, spoke calmly, and adjusted details subtly when circumstances changed. Through them, sacred memory remained continuous, passing smoothly between generations without disruption. Sacred places became more clearly defined during this time. Locations already associated with stillness or significance were visited deliberately. A spring that never dried, a hill that offered wide perspective, a grove where sound seemed muted. These places were not altered dramatically. Small markers appeared instead, stones arranged, objects placed and left undisturbed. Their purpose was not display, but recognition. As belief grew more structured, sacred figures began to reflect social roles within the community. Protectors, nurturers, watchers, and guides mirrored the responsibilities necessary for survival and cooperation. Through these figures, values were reinforced gently. Patience, respect, and balance were encouraged through story rather than rule. The gods became symbols of shared understanding rather than sources of command. Variation between communities remained natural. Stories differed according to landscape and experience. This diversity was not viewed as error. It was accepted as responsiveness. Belief adapted to context, allowing sacred figures to remain relevant within changing environments. Unity existed not in uniform detail, but in shared intention. Rituals became more recognizable, yet remained modest. Certain times of year were marked by repeated actions. Certain words were spoken in familiar sequences. These practices created continuity without rigidity, reinforcing identity through repetition rather than enforcement. Through this gradual refinement, belief gained resilience. It could endure migration, environmental change, and social shift without collapse. Sacred figures evolved alongside the people who imagined them, maintaining relevance through adaptability rather than permanence. As belief settled more deeply into communal identity, it became inseparable from belonging. To share stories, recognize sacred figures, and participate in ritual was to be part of the group. These shared practices offered reassurance during loss and transition, providing continuity when individual lives ended and new ones began. Even as people passed away, belief remained, carried forward through memory and habit. Sacred figures influenced daily decision-making in subtle ways. Actions were considered not only for immediate outcome, but for alignment with tradition. This perspective encouraged reflection rather than haste. Choices felt connected to a larger pattern of meaning, supporting social harmony without demanding obedience. Importantly, early gods were not portrayed as flawless or distant. Their stories reflected the unpredictability of life itself. Through them, communities explored change, renewal, and balance. These narratives allowed difficult experiences to be integrated gently, preserving emotional stability without denying uncertainty. As interaction between groups increased, belief systems traveled. Stories moved across landscapes through migration and exchange, blending with local traditions. New figures emerged, older ones adapted, and shared motifs appeared. These similarities revealed common human responses to universal questions about origin, loss, and continuity. despite differences in culture and environment. By this stage, worship had become a stable presence within human life. It offered coherence without certainty and structure without rigidity. The gods that emerged were not imposed from beyond. They were shaped slowly through lived experience, attention, and memory. From here, belief would leave behind material traces, objects, symbols, and spaces that later generations would encounter as mystery. These remnants invite quiet reflection, offering glimpses into the earliest moments when humans began to imagine gods, not as distant rulers, but as companions woven gently into the fabric of life. As belief continued to mature within these early communities, sacred figures gradually became anchors for collective memory. Stories associated with them were repeated not only during gatherings, but woven quietly into daily tasks. A familiar name might be spoken while preparing food, another remembered while watching the sky shift at dusk. These moments were unremarkable on the surface, yet they reinforced continuity, allowing belief to remain present without demanding attention. Over time, sacred narratives began to serve as a framework for understanding change. When landscapes altered or resources shifted, stories provided reassurance that transformation was part of a larger pattern. A river changing course or a forest thinning with age could be understood not as loss alone, but as movement within an enduring cycle. Through this lens, uncertainty became more tolerable, softened by meaning rather than resolved through explanation. As communities grew larger, belief helped maintain cohesion. Shared sacred figures offered a sense of familiarity among people who might not know one another personally. Recognizing the same stories, symbols, and rituals allowed trust to form without direct relationship. This shared spiritual language supported cooperation, enabling groups to function smoothly despite increasing complexity. The presence of gods also influenced how time was experienced. Moments were no longer isolated. They were situated within narratives that extended backward and forward. Seasonal rituals marked transitions gently, offering pauses that encouraged reflection. These pauses were not dramatic. They were quiet acknowledgments that time moved in cycles rather than straight lines, reinforcing patience and acceptance. Sacred figures themselves continued to evolve. As new experiences accumulated, their stories absorbed these changes. A god associated with fertility might gain qualities of protection during uncertain years. A spirit linked to travel might become associated with guidance as routes expanded. This fluidity ensured that belief remained responsive, reflecting lived reality rather than resisting it. Importantly, doubt was not excluded from early belief. Uncertainty existed alongside reverence, allowing sacred narratives to accommodate contradiction. When rituals failed to bring expected outcomes, stories adapted rather than shattered. This openness preserved belief as a living system, capable of absorbing disappointment without losing coherence. Through all of this, worship remained understated. There were no grand declarations, no fixed doctrines. Belief was expressed through continuity, through doing what had always been done, through remembering what had always been remembered. In this way, the gods of early humanity remained close, shaped by observation and care, rather than distance and command. As this phase of belief settled into stability, it left behind traces that would endure long after the original stories faded. Objects placed deliberately, spaces visited repeatedly, and symbols carved or painted with intention remained embedded in the landscape. These remnants would later invite curiosity and interpretation, offering glimpses into a time when gods emerged quietly from everyday life, carried forward through attention, memory, and shared experience. As these beliefs settled into habit and memory, they did not remain only in spoken words or quiet gestures. Over time, the practices shaped by reverence began to leave subtle marks upon the physical world. Objects were placed with intention rather than utility alone. Spaces were returned to again and again, their significance deepening through repetition. Though the voices that first carried these stories eventually faded, traces of their devotion remained embedded in earth, stone, and arrangement. From these quiet remnants, later generations would attempt to understand how early worship was lived, not merely imagined, turning attention toward the material echoes of belief preserved across long stretches of time. Long after the earliest voices fell quiet, the ground continued to remember. Layers of soil settled gently over places once visited with care, covering objects that had been touched, arranged, and left behind with intention. These remnants were not grand monuments or towering structures. They were subtle, small stones placed deliberately, shallow pits containing ash, fragments of bone or shell positioned with care. Yet within their quiet arrangement lay the enduring imprint of belief, preserved without words. Across open plains and forested valleys, repeated patterns begin to appear. Certain locations show signs of return rather than habitation. The earth is worn smooth by feet that came and went, yet no signs of daily life remain. Fires were lit briefly and extinguished. Objects were placed and left untouched. These spaces suggest pause rather than permanence, moments set apart from routine. Their purpose was not shelter or labor, but attention. Buried within some of these sites are collections of items that served no practical role together. Stones of unusual shape, animal remains arranged with symmetry, traces of pigment pressed into the soil. Their presence resists simple explanation. They appear too deliberate to be accidental, yet too restrained to be decorative. Over time, such discoveries encourage reflection on how early humans expressed meaning without formal symbols or written language. Caves offer particularly quiet testimony. Deep within their shadows, where sound softens and light fades, markings remain on walls shaped by patient hands. Lines curve gently, following the natural contours of stone. Animals appear not as prey, but as presence, rendered with care and attention. These images are often placed far from daily living spaces, suggesting that their creation required intention and effort. The journey inward itself may have been part of the experience, a movement away from the ordinary toward something inward and reflective. The placement of the deceased provides further insight. In many early burials, bodies were not abandoned or concealed randomly. They were positioned thoughtfully, accompanied by objects that held meaning rather than utility. Tools no longer used, ornaments worn smooth by touch, pigments applied gently to skin or surrounding earth. All suggest that death was understood not as disappearance, but as transition. These gestures imply belief in continuity, an understanding that life extended beyond visible presence. Animal remains appear frequently in ritual contexts as well. Certain species are found repeatedly in specific locations, their bones arranged or separated in ways that suggest symbolism. These patterns hint at relationships between humans and animals that went beyond survival alone. Animals may have represented guidance, strength, or transformation, reflecting the close observation early humans maintained with the natural world. Time itself leaves subtle marks within these spaces. Layers accumulate, showing that sites were revisited across generations. Ash from fires settles between periods of stillness. Objects are added gradually rather than all at once. This slow accumulation suggests that belief was not expressed through singular events, but through ongoing relationship. Each return reinforced significance, deepening meaning without altering form dramatically. In some regions, early structures begin to appear, simple arrangements of stone or earth shaped with restraint. Circles, alignments, and mounds emerge, often oriented toward natural features or celestial patterns. These constructions required cooperation and patience. Their scale remained human, integrated into the landscape rather than imposed upon it. They speak of shared intention carried out calmly, without urgency. The alignment of certain sites with the movement of sun, moon, or stars offers further indication of early spiritual awareness. Openings framed the horizon where light appeared at particular times of year. Stones cast shadows that shifted predictably. These observations suggest careful attention to cycles larger than individual lives. By marking these moments, early communities acknowledge their place within a broader rhythm, reinforcing continuity across time. What remains most striking is the restraint evident in these traces. There is little sign of excess or display. Objects are few, spaces are modest, expression remains quiet. This restraint suggests that belief was not driven by spectacle, but by familiarity and care. The sacred was approached gently, without separation from the natural world. Modern interpretation must move carefully through these remnants. Meaning cannot be imposed quickly or confidently. Instead, understanding emerges slowly, through pattern and context rather than declaration. Each site offers only a fragment, requiring patience to assemble into a broader picture. In this way, the study of early belief mirrors belief itself, shaped by attention, repetition, and humility before uncertainty. Through earth and stone, early worship speaks softly across time. It does not announce itself. It waits to be noticed. In these quiet traces, the beginnings of religion remain present, not as doctrine or command, but as evidence of humans seeking connection, continuity, and meaning within a world that felt vast, alive, and enduring. The interpretation of these quiet remains continues to unfold slowly, shaped by comparison rather than certainty. When similar arrangements appear across distant regions, stones placed in comparable patterns, burials oriented in familiar ways, pigments used sparingly but consistently, it suggests shared ways of thinking rather than direct connection. These parallels point toward common human responses to uncertainty and loss, revealing that early belief emerged independently, yet followed recognizable paths. Tools found in ritual contexts often differ subtly from those used in daily labor. They show less wear, fewer repairs, and careful placement after use. Their preservation suggests that they were handled with intention, removed from ordinary cycles of work. Once set aside, they were rarely disturbed. This separation implies an early distinction between the everyday and the meaningful, not enforced by rule, but maintained through shared understanding. Fire remains a recurring presence in these sites. Ash layers appear thin and controlled, indicating brief use rather than prolonged occupation. Fires were lit, tended, and extinguished deliberately. Their warmth and light may have framed moments of reflection rather than necessity. In these moments, sound would have softened, shadows lengthened, and attention narrowed. Such environments naturally encouraged inward focus, reinforcing the emotional dimension of belief. The absence of written explanation leaves interpretation open. No single object explains intention fully. Instead, meaning accumulates through association, through where items were placed, how often sites were revisited, and what was consistently avoided. Certain areas remain untouched despite proximity, suggesting boundaries respected without markers. These invisible limits indicate shared agreement, reinforcing the idea that belief operated through collective awareness rather than instruction. As archaeological methods improve, new details emerge without disrupting earlier impressions. Microscopic traces reveal pigments mixed carefully, soils disturbed gently, and materials selected with discernment. These findings reinforce the sense of attentiveness present in early ritual behavior. Actions were not hurried. They were considered, repeated, and remembered. What remains most enduring is the emotional restraint evident throughout these sites. There is little sign of urgency or display. Belief was not expressed through dominance over landscape, but through alignment with it. Structures followed natural contours. Objects echoed existing forms. The sacred did not replace the natural. It emerged from it. In this way, early religion leaves behind a quiet legacy. It appears not as a single origin point, but as a gradual layering of meaning onto familiar spaces and objects. Each trace reflects a moment of attention, a pause taken, an object placed, a space revisited. Together, these moments form a pattern that speaks softly across time. As the evidence settles into broader understanding, it becomes clear that belief was lived before it was named. It existed in action before explanation, in habit before structure. These archaeological traces offer more than proof of early worship. They reveal a way of being, patient, observant, and deeply connected to the rhythms of the world. From these remnants, the narrative moves forward once again. Beyond the quiet spaces of ritual and memory, belief would begin to shape social order, influence, leadership, and structure communal life. The unseen would gradually find expression not only in earth and stone, but in hierarchy, ceremony, and the organization of human society itself. As the quiet marks of belief settled into earth and stone, their influence did not remain confined to hidden spaces or infrequent gatherings. Over time, the habits shaped by reverence began to influence how communities organized themselves, how decisions were made, and how responsibility was distributed. What had once been shared informally through memory and gesture gradually found expression in roles, routines, and structures that brought belief into the center of communal life. From this slow shift emerged a new layer of human experience, where the sacred and the social began to move closely together. Within growing communities, certain individuals became more closely associated with sacred knowledge. They were not chosen suddenly, nor did they claim authority openly. Their position emerged through familiarity and trust, built over time as they remembered rituals accurately, observed seasonal changes carefully, and guided communal practices with calm consistency. Their presence brought reassurance. When uncertainty arose, they recalled older patterns, reminding others of continuity rather than offering instruction. These figures often lived lives outwardly similar to those around them. They gathered food, shared meals, and participated in daily labor. Yet their role carried subtle distinction. They were approached during moments of transition, before journeys, after loss, during seasonal change. Their words were measured, their movements deliberate. Through repetition, their presence became associated with stability, shaping a quiet form of leadership rooted in memory rather than command. As belief became more integrated into social life, spaces of gathering grew more defined. Open areas once used casually began to carry expectation. Certain times of year brought people together in predictable rhythms. These gatherings were not loud or dramatic. They unfolded with calm purpose, marked by shared silence as much as shared action. The atmosphere encouraged attentiveness, reinforcing a sense of collective identity shaped by participation rather than observation. Material differences also began to appear, though they remained restrained. Objects associated with sacred roles were handled carefully and stored separately. They were not lavish, but they were distinct, worn smooth by touch, familiar in shape and use. Their presence signaled continuity, linking present practice to earlier memory. Possession of these objects did not imply ownership, but responsibility. As communities expanded, belief helped organize cooperation. Seasonal labor, shared construction, and food distribution benefited from shared understanding, reinforced through ritual. By aligning work with sacred timing, effort gained meaning beyond necessity. Tasks felt connected to larger cycles, encouraging patience and coordination. In this way, belief supported social harmony quietly, reducing conflict through shared expectation rather than enforcement. Hierarchy emerged gradually within this framework. Certain families or individuals became associated with specific roles across generations. Their familiarity with ritual and story established lineage not through wealth, but through continuity. Authority rested on reliability. Decisions were accepted because they aligned with established pattern, not because they were imposed. This form of leadership felt natural, shaped by habit and trust accumulated over time. Gender roles within sacred life varied across communities, yet often reflected broader social balance. In some groups, women held central positions in ritual practice, guiding ceremonies tied to fertility, continuity, and transition. In others, men assumed visible roles linked to protection or seasonal movement. These distinctions were rarely rigid. They adapted to environment and necessity, reflecting practical experience rather than fixed ideology. As sacred roles became more visible, boundaries formed gently. Certain spaces were approached with greater care. Certain moments called for restraint. These boundaries were maintained through shared understanding, not force. Their presence encouraged reflection, slowing movement and speech in ways that reinforced reverence. Through this moderation, belief remained integrated rather than dominating, guiding behavior subtly without overwhelming daily life. Over time, the sacred and the social grew increasingly intertwined. Leadership drew legitimacy from tradition. Tradition gained resilience through organization, yet belief retained its earlier softness. It did not demand uniformity or obedience. It offered orientation, helping communities navigate complexity without urgency. As this social expression of belief settled into place, it laid the groundwork for broader systems. networks of exchange, shared symbols, and expanding interaction between groups. The sacred now moved alongside trade, travel, and communication, shaping a wider world where belief flowed across landscapes as steadily as people themselves. The influence of belief continued to deepen as communities became more settled and interconnected. Ritual gatherings began to follow more predictable sequences, marked by familiar sounds, repeated movements, and shared stillness. Drums or simple instruments might sound at measured intervals, not to excite, but to maintain rhythm. Voices rose and fell together, creating a sense of unity that softened individual presence. These moments reinforced belonging, reminding each participant that they were part of something larger and enduring. Over time, the responsibilities tied to sacred roles expanded. Those entrusted with ritual knowledge also became mediators during disagreement. Their familiarity with tradition positioned them to recall earlier resolutions, guiding communities toward balance rather than confrontation. Decisions were framed within established patterns, allowing conflict to dissolve gradually rather than escalate. In this way, belief supported social cohesion quietly, offering reference points that eased tension without judgment. Structures began to appear that reflected this integration of belief and organization. These were not monumental at first. Simple shelters, marked areas, or lightly modified natural spaces served as focal points. Their design emphasized accessibility rather than separation. People entered freely, moving slowly, aware of shared expectation. The sacred remained close to daily life, not elevated beyond reach. As generations passed, memory accumulated within these spaces. Objects left behind, tools, offerings, symbols, were rarely removed. Each addition layered meaning without erasing what came before. The result was a sense of depth, where the presence of past participation could be felt even in silence. These layers reinforced continuity, allowing belief to persist through change without rigid preservation. Social distinctions, though present, remained understated. Those associated with sacred responsibility were recognized through behavior rather than appearance. Their authority was expressed through restraint, attentiveness, and consistency. Excess was discouraged, not through rule, but through shared understanding that balance sustained trust. The expectation shaped conduct, encouraging humility within leadership and participation within community. As interaction between groups increased, sacred practices traveled alongside people. When communities met, similarities in ritual and belief fostered recognition. Differences were observed calmly, often absorbed gradually. Through these exchanges, belief systems expanded without losing coherence. Shared symbols and stories bridged distance, allowing cooperation to emerge naturally. The integration of belief into social life did not erase individuality. Instead, it provided a framework within which personal experience could be understood. Birth, aging, and death were marked gently, acknowledged through shared practice rather than dramatic ceremony. These moments reaffirmed continuity, reminding communities that change was expected and accommodated within tradition. By this stage, belief had become inseparable from social structure. It guided leadership, organized cooperation, and shaped identity without demanding uniformity. Its strength lay in subtlety, allowing communities to grow and adapt while remaining anchored in shared understanding. As this layer of organization settled into stability, belief prepared to move outward once more. Beyond villages and familiar landscapes, so would accompany travel, trade, and exchange, shaping interaction across wider regions. In doing so, belief would continue its quiet journey, extending influence beyond local life into a broader human world shaped by connection and movement. As belief became woven into social roles and communal order, it did not remain anchored to a single place. People moved, paths extended, and contact between distant groups grew more frequent. Along these routes of movement, belief traveled quietly, carried not as doctrine, but as habit, symbol, and shared expectation. What had formed within familiar landscapes now encountered new environments, adapting gently as it went. From this slow outward motion emerged a broader world, where trade, travel, and belief intertwined without haste. Movement across land and water followed the pace of endurance rather than urgency. Paths were shaped gradually by repeated passage, pressed into soil by many feet over long periods of time. Along these routes, travelers carried more than goods. They carried stories, gestures, and familiar ways of acknowledging the unseen. A pause before departure, a quiet moment at arrival, a small offering left behind. These practices traveled easily, requiring no explanation. Exchange between communities unfolded calmly. When people met beyond their home territories, interaction began with observation rather than assumption. Shared symbols offered reassurance. Similar arrangements of objects, familiar patterns of marking space, or comparable gestures of respect suggested common ground. Even when languages differed, these quiet signals allowed recognition to form, easing uncertainty through familiarity. Trade itself became an extension of belief. Objects moved between regions not only for their usefulness, but for the meaning attached to them. Shells from distant waters, stones from unfamiliar hills, and pigments gathered far from their place of use entered new contexts, carrying layered significance. Their presence suggested connection beyond immediate surroundings, reinforcing the idea that the world extended farther than lived experience alone. Rivers played a central role in this expansion. Flowing steadily through varied terrain, they connected communities separated by distance and landscape. Travel along water encouraged patience, allowing reflection during long journeys. Stops along the way became predictable, marked by familiarity rather than infrastructure. In these spaces, shared practices reinforced continuity, creating informal networks shaped by habit rather than agreement. Belief adapted as it traveled. Sacred figures associated with one environment gradually absorbed qualities drawn from another. Stories changed subtly, reflecting new landscapes and experiences. This process did not erase earlier meaning. It expanded it. Through adaptation, belief remained relevant, capable of encompassing difference without fragmentation. Seasonal gatherings emerged where routes intersected. These moments brought people together briefly, creating opportunities for exchange beyond goods. Rituals were observed, compared, and sometimes blended. Similarities encouraged recognition, while differences invited curiosity rather than conflict. Over time, shared elements grew more prominent, forming loose networks of belief that stretched across regions without uniformity. Material culture reflected this movement. Objects associated with ritual were crafted in familiar forms but from local materials. A symbol carved from wood in one place appeared shaped from stone in another. This continuity of form reinforced shared understanding, even as surface details varied. Meaning traveled more easily than material, adapting naturally to context. Environmental awareness remained central throughout this process. Belief continued to align with landscape, responding to climate, terrain, and resource availability. In coastal regions, the sea gained prominence. In arid lands, attention turned toward sky and seasonal rain. These variations did not contradict one another. They reflected responsiveness, allowing belief to remain grounded rather than imposed. Over time, certain routes gained reputations not only for trade, but for shared understanding. Travelers recognized places where practices overlapped, where familiar gestures were returned. These points of connection reduced isolation, fostering cooperation across distance. Through them, belief supported wider interaction without requiring centralized control. Despite this expansion, belief retained its earlier restraint. There was little attempt to dominate or convert. Practices were shared through presence rather than persuasion. Adoption occurred slowly, through familiarity and usefulness rather than argument. This gentle transmission allowed belief to spread without disruption, preserving local identity while encouraging connection. As networks widened, belief began to shape broader patterns of interaction. Agreements were reinforced through ritual acknowledgement. Trust extended beyond immediate acquaintance, supported by shared symbols and expectations. These developments laid the groundwork for more complex systems of exchange and cooperation, preparing communities for deeper interdependence. Yet even as belief traveled far, it remained rooted in the same impulse that first gave it form: attention to the world, awareness of continuity, and respect for forces beyond individual control. Across plains, rivers, and coastlines, this impulse remained recognizable, shaping human interaction quietly and consistently. As movement slowed and networks settled into familiarity, belief prepared for another transformation. Beyond travel and exchange, it would begin to influence reflection itself, how humans understood their place within time, change, and the wider patterns of existence. From this outward expansion, attention would turn inward once more, toward meaning carried across generations rather than distances. As these routes of movement became familiar, belief settled into a quieter, more enduring presence within them. What once felt new or uncertain softened into habit. Travelers no longer paused to consider each gesture or symbol. They performed them naturally, guided by memory rather than intention. The exchange of goods, stories, and customs flowed with steady ease, shaped by repetition rather than novelty. Over time, the influence of belief along these networks became less visible, yet more deeply rooted. Sacred practices were no longer distinguished from ordinary conduct. They blended into greetings, agreements, and departures, reinforcing trust without ceremony. A shared pause, a familiar mark, or a recognized pattern of arrangement carried meaning enough. Through these understated signals, cooperation endured across distance, sustained by quiet continuity rather than formal structure. As generations followed these same paths, the origin of many practices faded from awareness. What remained was familiarity. Belief no longer needed explanation or reinforcement. It existed as background understanding, shaping expectations subtly and consistently. In this way, The sacred traveled far without announcing itself, becoming part of the unspoken fabric that connected distant lives. Eventually, movement slowed, routes stabilized, exchange became predictable. With expansion complete, belief no longer needed to adapt outward. Instead, it began to turn inward, shaping reflection rather than connection alone. The question was no longer how belief traveled, but how it endured, how it helped people understand time, loss, and continuity beyond immediate experience. From this broad landscape of shared movement and quiet exchange, the narrative now drifts toward stillness. Attention settles on what belief ultimately offered to humanity, not as structure or system, but as a way of making sense of existence itself, carried gently across generations long after the paths themselves had grown quiet. As belief continued to accompany these established routes, it became increasingly subtle in its expression. No longer marked by deliberate acts alone, it lived within posture, timing, and restraint. Travelers learned when to speak and when to remain silent, when to pause and when to proceed. These instincts were not taught formally. They were absorbed through repetition, shaped by countless small interactions where familiarity replaced explanation. In places where routes converged, longer periods of stillness emerged. Temporary gatherings extended into seasonal encampments, where people remained together for days rather than hours. During these times, belief took on a quieter depth. Shared meals unfolded without urgency. Nights were spent listening to the sounds of unfamiliar landscapes, the wind moving differently, the stars arranged in new patterns overhead. These experiences encouraged reflection rather than comparison, allowing belief to expand gently without conflict. Objects exchanged during these encounters often gained layered meaning. A shell carried far inland was no longer simply decorative. It became a reminder of distant water and long journeys. A stone tool shaped according to one tradition but used within another carried traces of both. Over time, these objects acted as quiet witnesses to connection, their presence reinforcing the sense that life extended beyond immediate surroundings. Belief also began to influence how agreements were understood. Exchanges were often sealed not only through gesture or object, but through shared moments of stillness. A brief pause, a mutual acknowledgement of space, or a repeated sequence of actions served to confirm intention. These moments required no witnesses. Their power lay in mutual recognition, supported by shared understanding of sacred continuity. As belief settled into these practices, it shaped patience. Waiting became acceptable, even expected. Journeys were undertaken with the understanding that delay was part of movement. Outcomes unfolded gradually. This acceptance softened frustration, allowing cooperation to persist despite uncertainty. Belief did not promise predictability. It offered reassurance that delay did not equate to failure. Environmental awareness remained central. Travelers learned to read subtle signs, the quality of light, the movement of air, the behavior of animals. These observations guided decisions more reliably than planning alone. Belief supported this attentiveness, encouraging respect for conditions beyond human control. In this way, the sacred remained aligned with observation rather than abstraction. As networks matured, fewer new practices were introduced. Stability replaced expansion. Belief no longer needed to prove its relevance. It was assumed. Its presence was felt most strongly in its absence, when disruptions occurred, and familiar rhythms faltered. During such moments, communities turned inward, relying on shared memory to restore balance. Over long periods, the distinction between belief and culture faded further. What had once been sacred gesture became custom. What had once been ritual became tradition. This transformation did not diminish meaning. It embedded it more deeply, allowing belief to endure without constant reinforcement. Through this gradual settling, belief fulfilled one of its quiet purposes. It connected past experience to present action without demanding attention. It allowed humans to move through a changing world with a sense of continuity, even as landscapes shifted and generations passed. As this extended phase of movement and exchange drew gently to a close, belief remained present, not as something carried deliberately, but as something lived unconsciously. It shaped how people waited, how they trusted, and how they understood their place within a wider, enduring pattern. From this calm expansion across land and time, the narrative prepares to turn once more. Beyond roots and exchange lies reflection itself, how belief, once rooted in survival and connection, came to offer meaning beyond immediate life, shaping how humans understood existence, memory, and the quiet passage of time. As movement slowed and familiar paths settled into memory, belief no longer needed to travel outward. Its presence had become so deeply embedded in habit, language, and expectation that it moved without motion. What once followed footsteps across landscapes now followed thought across generations. From this stillness emerged a quieter phase, where belief turned inward, shaping reflection rather than expansion, offering continuity not through place, but through meaning. As belief reached a stage of quiet maturity within human societies, it no longer announced itself through visible ritual or constant explanation. Instead, it settled gently into the background of daily life, shaping perception without demanding attention. Movements once performed with awareness became instinctive. Words once spoken with intention softened into habit. Reverence did not disappear. It dissolved into familiarity, becoming something lived rather than named. Across long stretches of time, belief served as a vessel for memory. Individual lives unfolded briefly, yet shared understanding endured well beyond them. Experiences that might have faded were preserved through repetition, retelling, and quiet acknowledgement. In this way, belief connected people not only to those around them, but also to those who had lived before and those who would follow. Memory became collective, held lightly, carried forward without urgency. Gradually, the experience of time itself changed. Life was no longer understood as a single path moving forward, but as part of a larger rhythm shaped by return. Seasons echoed earlier seasons. Stories resurfaced with subtle variation. Ritual gestures repeated, altered slightly by circumstance, yet recognizable in form. This repetition did not reduce meaning. It deepened it. Familiarity provided reassurance, allowing uncertainty to feel less abrupt and less isolating. As belief continued to evolve, its focus shifted away from explanation. The need to define unseen forces or resolve unanswered questions softened. Instead, belief offered orientation. It provided a way of standing within the world without demanding certainty. Mystery remained present, but it no longer required resolution. Acceptance replaced urgency. Reflection took the place of insistence. Within communities, belief guided social life in quiet ways. Transitions were acknowledged gently. Births were welcomed without spectacle, Aging was recognized without resistance. Death was marked without excess. These moments were woven into shared awareness rather than set apart dramatically. Through such restraint, belief reinforced continuity, reminding people that change was expected and shared rather than sudden or isolating. Over generations, belief shaped moral understanding without rigid instruction. Ideas of balance, responsibility, and restraint were passed through example and story rather than command. Actions were considered not only for immediate outcome, but for their place within a larger pattern. This perspective encouraged patience. It allowed room for error without collapse, offering interpretation instead of judgment. As sacred meaning became less bound to specific places or objects, it grew more abstract. This abstraction did not weaken belief. It allowed it to endure. Freed from reliance on physical markers, belief moved easily across time, adapting to new conditions without losing its core impulse. Names changed, symbols shifted, yet the underlying desire for connection and continuity remained intact. Reflection increasingly turned inward. Individuals carried belief within themselves, shaping their understanding of effort, solitude, and rest. Silence gained value. Pauses became meaningful. In stillness, belief revealed one of its most enduring qualities, its ability to exist without demand. It did not require constant reinforcement. It waited quietly, available rather than imposed. Across centuries, the earliest origins of worship grew distant, yet their influence persisted. Gods were named differently. Rituals were reshaped. Stories were translated, altered, and absorbed into new cultures. Still, the foundational pattern endured. Humans continued to sense that life unfolded within something larger than immediate perception. This sense did not insist on clarity. It offered context. Through this long evolution, belief fulfilled a quiet purpose. It allowed humanity to live within uncertainty without feeling unanchored. It connected individuals to communities, communities to memory, and memory to meaning. It did not promise control or final answers. It offered continuity. As belief became embedded within culture itself, its presence grew less visible but more resilient. What once required deliberate practice now persisted through habit. What once needed explanation now existed as assumption. In this way, belief survived not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. Adaptability became its strength. Belief shaped how people waited, how they endured difficulty, and how they understood loss. It softened the edges of experience without denying hardship. It encouraged patience rather than urgency, reflection rather than reaction. Through these qualities, belief supported emotional stability across generations. Even as societies transformed, belief remained recognizable. Though stripped of early forms, it continued to answer the same human needs. It offered reassurance during uncertainty, orientation during transition, and connection during solitude. These functions endured regardless of language or structure. In the end, what remains is not a single origin or definitive form, but a pattern carried forward across time. A pattern of attention, care, and quiet reflection. The earliest gods were not born solely from fear or from a desire for mastery. They emerged from observation, memory, and the enduring human impulse to understand existence as part of something shared and ongoing. As the long arc of belief settles into stillness, it returns to quiet familiarity. Fires burn low, stories soften through repetition. Days continue their gentle rhythm, shaped by cycles older than memory. Within that rhythm, the beginnings of worship remain, subtle, enduring, and present still, resting quietly as humanity moves onward through time. As belief continued to rest within this quiet familiarity, it shaped not only how people understood the world, but how they endured it. In moments of uncertainty, belief did not rush forward with answers. It lingered instead, encouraging stillness and patience. This lingering presence allowed hardship to be absorbed gradually, softened through shared understanding rather than confronted alone. Even when circumstances shifted unexpectedly, belief offered reassurance that change itself was part of an older rhythm. Across generations, this perspective influenced how effort was valued. Work was no longer measured solely by outcome, but by participation within a larger pattern. Repeated tasks gained meaning through continuity rather than achievement. The same motions performed day after day became expressions of belonging. In this way, belief honored persistence over urgency, reinforcing the idea that endurance itself carried significance. Memory continued to deepen. Stories were not preserved for accuracy alone, but for familiarity. Details shifted gently as they were retold, shaped by the needs of each generation. This flexibility allowed belief to remain relevant without losing coherence. What mattered was not exact repetition, but recognition. The sense that each story belonged to a longer conversation extending beyond individual experience. As societies grew more complex, belief provided a stabilizing counterbalance. While structures changed and relationships evolved, belief remained adaptable, offering continuity without rigidity. It encouraged humility in the face of uncertainty, reminding people that not all aspects of existence required control or resolution. Through this humility, belief fostered resilience, allowing communities to recover from disruption without losing identity. Silence continued to play a central role. In pauses between activity, belief found space to exist without articulation. These moments of quiet, at dawn, at dusk, during rest, allowed reflection to surface naturally. In such stillness, belief revealed its capacity to coexist with doubt, holding uncertainty without pressure. This acceptance proved essential, allowing belief to endure without exhaustion. Across cultures and eras, this quiet inheritance persisted. Though forms differed, the underlying impulse remained consistent. Humans continued to sense that life unfolded within a broader context, one shaped by forces beyond immediate perception. This sense did not require uniform belief. It allowed diversity, encouraging varied expression while maintaining shared orientation. As centuries passed, belief became increasingly intertwined with identity itself. It shaped how people understood belonging, purpose, and continuity. Even when belief was questioned or reinterpreted, its presence remained influential. The impulse to seek meaning beyond immediate experience endured, reflecting a fundamental aspect of human awareness. In this extended arc, belief revealed its most enduring quality, its capacity to remain present without insistence. It did not dominate thought or demand attention. It rested quietly, ready to surface when needed, then recede once more into familiarity. This balance allowed belief to persist without overwhelming the lives it accompanied. Through this enduring presence, belief continued to shape how humans related to time. The future was approached with patience rather than expectation. The past was remembered without fixation. The present was inhabited with attentiveness. In this way, belief supported a gentle equilibrium, holding experience together without tension. As the final layers of this long reflection settle, belief remains neither distant nor absolute. It exists as orientation rather than authority, as context rather than command. Its strength lies in subtlety, its endurance in adaptability. Carried forward through memory, habit, and quiet attention, belief continues to shape human experience, resting calmly within the ongoing rhythm of life. As this long reflection comes to rest, the story settles into silence once more. The distant past fades gently, not disappearing, but blending into the steady rhythm of the present. Belief remains where it has always been, woven into habit, memory, and quiet attention. It no longer asks to be named or examined. It simply endures. Beyond words and stories, the world continues its slow turning. Light shifts, seasons pass, lives unfold and return to stillness. Within these cycles, the earliest impulses of reverence persist, softened by time, carried forward through countless ordinary moments. What began as wonder beside firelight now rests as familiarity, steady and unobtrusive. And so the night grows calm again. Thought loosens its grip. Memory drifts without effort. The long human search for meaning settles into rest, carried onward by the same gentle rhythm that has always guided it. Unbroken, unhurried, and quietly at peace.